Thanks for tuning in for the second installment of Money Talks, and today we are looking at Chapter 2, which is Save Me versus Hoard Me. We know that there's a huge difference between being good stewards, we call this stewardship, where we are carrying or managing what God has given us, because all of our resources and all of our belongings ultimately belong to God. However, there's an extremism when we start to hoard, because instead of us owning our stuff or our money, the stuff owns us. And so there's a difference between simply saving it to be a good steward and hoarding it where we don't want to spend anything and we want to continue to accumulate more and more and more.
So I come from a long line of financial people. I mean, it seems like everyone in my family is somehow involved in finance of some sort. So we were taught early on that you were supposed to save, save, save. And I got to life as an adult and was faithfully saving, following God. And I had a friend in a Bible study I was in challenge me, and he said, "Callie, I don't think saving is biblical." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he really challenged me to dig deeper and figure out, is it biblical? Where is it biblical? Should we even accumulate anything at all? And in the church, we see these two different extremes, and I think the healthy response is honestly somewhere in the middle. But we see on one side the prosperity gospel, and perhaps you've heard that stereotype from maybe TV evangelist or somewhere where they say, if you give to God and my XYZ ministry, then God is going to bless you financially. You're going to start driving a Mercedes Benz, maybe a Jaguar. Our church parking lot is going to be filled with nice cars if you start giving more generously back to God. And it's that prosperity gospel where you give in order to get something and God will bless you, and everyone is going to be super wealthy if they follow Jesus. And on the other side, you have the folks that have more of a poverty gospel, saying, well, if you're actually following Jesus, Jesus didn't even have a place to lay his head. I mean, he went from place to place, dependent on the generosity of others. He did not accumulate stuff. When he sent out his disciples, often he said, don't take anything with you. Just go and let God take care of you. So, and then you also see that often in our Catholic faith, the brothers and sisters who decide to go into religious life and take religious orders, they take a vow of poverty. So God calls some to that, and it's but not everybody. And so you have examples in the Bible of those who lived with nothing and those that were extremely wealthy. I mean, think of King Solomon. He's estimated to be one of the wealthiest people ever. And he didn't ask for wealth. He asked for wisdom to govern the people wisely. And God blessed him with that wealth as well. And then you have folks like Job, who was extremely wealthy, then lost everything and experienced poverty, and then God restored him even more fold, so he was even wealthier than to start with. So you've got examples of both in Scripture. So I think the challenge is, what has God blessed you with? How are you going to be faithful with what you do have?
You know, the bad word that is often talked about when we even speak about money, it's a four-letter word. Actually, it's not, but it's a word called budget, right? And the budget we think of is this evil thing. So I like to think of budgeting almost as nutrition and weight loss. As people try to do that and attempt to do that, it's trying to burn more calories than you take in, essentially, is what you're trying to do. And with budgeting, it's spending less than what your income is, because ultimately you're trying to save. But you don't want to get to a place where you're just hoarding. So there is that delicate balance.
But as you start to spend less than you earn, one of the things you can start doing is building liquidity. That means you've got a cash cushion. Some folks refer to it as an emergency fund. So if something happens, you don't have to put it on the credit card. You know, if your HVAC goes out and you need to replace it, or you need a repair on your car, or something happens, you got that budget, that cushion. A lot of folks advocate for starting with an emergency fund of about $1,000. Some of you might say, that is way too high for me based on my income. Start somewhere. Start with a goal maybe of $200 and start to build. And the long-term goal is to have liquidity of a couple months of living expenses in reserve. And again, that varies based on the person, who needs how much. You know, if you are a two-income family, or you're a single person, but you've got a side hustle as well, so you got some extra income over here, you might not need as many months of living expenses saved up as, say, a one earner income household with a lot of dependents. Maybe a one earner in the family with like 10 kids. You're going to need a few more months of living expenses saved up to have that liquidity, to have that cushion. But the nice thing is then when something does happen, you don't have to put it on the credit card. And that then if you do have to use it, that's okay. That's what it's there for. You just build it back up again so that you have a little bit of margin, a little bit of space in your budget.
Saving for long-term purchases goes with that as well in terms of building liquidity. I can't help but remember when Callie and I were engaged, the only way that she would say she would marry me is by going through financial study.
And we wanted to be on the same page with that.
So we did that, but we got other couples, future married couples from our church to join in as well. And it was interesting because one couple who was going to get married was actually going to put their honeymoon on their credit card and go into debt. Well, while they were doing the study, they decided that they were going to try to earn extra income and save it and not have to go on this lavish vacation, but still go on a nice one and not put it on their credit card. So they decided that they were going to end up saving their resources for that long-term purchase, which was at the time their honeymoon. So think about the long-term purchases that you want to have that you don't have to go into debt for, but that you can start now to just have that steady plotting, whether it's a travel budget or a new car budget, whatever it might be, every month that you're adding and contributing to.
And then retirement's another example of that. That steady plotting, building up for retirement, the sooner you start doing it, the greater it builds. And now some of you might be thinking, I've got all this debt. Again, it's steady plotting, even paying off that debt. You get the liquidity built up, that emergency fund, and then you work on getting out of debt, especially if it's credit card debt with those high interest rates. And sometimes you might need to take drastic measures to get there. Maybe it's even selling some things. It might be downsizing. It might be going to a smaller house or going to one car for a while, but doing those things to get out of debt. But then as you get out of debt, it's that saving for retirement so that one day you don't have to be dependent on a paycheck. And it might be that you're still doing work, maybe you're doing ministry, but you're just not worrying about the paycheck. You're freed up to serve God and do it for free. But we've been talking about some of these financial wealth principles, but there's actually a piece that's even more important, and that's the spiritual wealth. Take a look at this graph. I wanted to be a middle school math teacher growing up, so I love a good graph. So if you hated math in middle school, I apologize, bear with me. But along that horizontal axis, you see the financial wealth. So take a minute and figure out, roughly where you are, and are you on the wealthier side? Are you on where I have financially less side? But then on the vertical axis is spiritual wealth. And I would argue this is far more important than the financial wealth piece, because on that spiritual wealth side, you can live with a scarcity mindset or an abundance mindset. And that scarcity abundance mindset language comes from Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that you can live as if you don't have enough, as if there's never enough, as if you're never going to make it, as you have to hold on to things tightly. And that's where we get to the hoarding side. Or you can live with that abundance mentality of God has given me more than enough for all I need. And I've got enough where I can share, where I can be a blessing to others. And so take a minute and figure out where you are on that graph, both on the horizontal line of financial wealth, but also on the vertical line of spiritual wealth. And if you don't have a lot financially, that's okay. The important thing is to move into that abundance mentality side, looking at all that God's given, all that God's blessed you with, giving thanks to God for what you do have, and then doing some of that steady plotting to move financially to a better spot, not so that you can have more, so you can hoard more, but so that you have more than you can give and more that you can bless others with. And you can have a lot of money and also have that scarcity mindset. There are a lot of folks that are so wealthy, but they don't want to share any of it because they're worried they won't have enough and they need more and more and more. And it's really that posture of the heart.
So take a moment right now and decide where you're at on that axis.
And A powerful principle there is Matthew 6:20, about where Jesus says to store up your treasure in heaven. And you don't have to worry about rust there. You don't have to worry about thieves breaking in and stealing. But where do you put that treasure? That's the important part to store up. That's the most important part to save. And we'll get more on the giving piece later, but that is a passion of ours. So it is a part of this saving so that you can be generous, so that you have enough, more than enough, to be able to share. So a big piece of that is this practice of surrender, knowing that it all belongs to God anyway. And so often hoarding means we're holding things with a closed fist, but what does it look like to open your hands? And so a powerful prayer practice that we do with all things, but especially finances, is to open our hands and just imagine in our hands all that God's given you, all that's weighing on you, all that you have. So if you're watching right now, even if people are around, go ahead and do that, even though no one's looking at you. Don't worry about what they think. Open your hands and just visualize all that you have and start giving God thanks for those things. Whether it's a job, whether it's a car, whether it's a home, even if you have debt on your house, even if it's a place that you're renting that God's provided, or even if you're living with a friend or family member, and then all the stuff God's given you, the money in your bank account, your retirement savings, just all those gifts that God's given you. And then imagine God's big hands underneath. And when you're ready, sometimes this takes a little bravery, slowly turn your hands over, surrendering all that you have into God's hands. Knowing that God loves you so much and He's going to take care of you, but what does it look like to trust God with everything, to surrender it to God? When we went through that financial Bible study as we were engaged, getting ready to get married, we did one of these powerful things called writing out a quitclaim deed. We wrote on a paper and wrote the words, God, I surrender to you. And literally, it wasn't a legal document, but wrote down everything we were giving to God, all the possessions we had, that we were saying, God, these are yours and available to you to use. And when you do that, watch what God might do. I bet you'll have some cool stories of how God then starts to use your home for ministry, how God starts using that car for ministry, how God starts stirring on your heart with some of the things that you have in your possession to be able to bless others.
So how do you know if you're hoarding? We've talked about saving and that it's a spiritual practice, but it needs to be in balance. But how do you know if you're hoarding? If you have more than you need, and you can judge how much is enough, how much do you need. So that might mean decluttering. I know for us, whenever we buy maybe a new article of clothing, we try to go through our closet and actually donate whatever we don't wear because we want to make room, but we also don't want to hoard. We use that as an opportunity every once in a while with our kids' toys, or even as we've moved over the last few years, what don't we need and what can we give over to bless others? And this kind of parallels not just the physical decluttering, but the spiritual decluttering, because oftentimes our bodies and our minds can get cluttered with just so many different things, and our possessions can begin to own us when we start to worry about them over and over again. And so decluttering even the inside of us, or emptying ourselves so we can be filled with God's love and God's Spirit, will help us to manage and being resources of God's resources. So we are stewards of God's stewardship goals.
And another thing is setting a financial finish line, actually figuring out how much do you need to save to be able to retire. And there are a lot of tools online you can play around with. Often there are a lot of different assumptions. And if you have a financial advisor that you use for your retirement, they can generally run some of these for you. But play around, see how much do you actually need? Because a lot of those unknowns are what make us nervous about figuring out, is there going to be enough? Will I ever be able to retire one day? Or maybe you're already retired and want to figure out, will my retirement savings last? And once you know that number, there can be freedom in that. You've got a goal to work toward, and you can set money aside. And you might find out, I don't need to save as much as I thought I did. I can be more generous now because I'm doing enough to save. Or you might realize, I need to be saving faster if I do want to retire. What are some of those things you can do maybe to adjust your spending so that you've got more available saved to set aside to be able to retire one day?
When we save, we are operating not just as good stewards, but we're operating in faith. However, when we save so much and we don't spend anything and we're afraid to spend is when we give into fear. And so there is that balance and that tension that we want to choose faith over fear, especially with our finances as well.
It's a big posture of the heart. It's trusting and surrendering and honestly putting God as Lord of your life and putting your trust in God, not how much money is in your bank account. So that's a big heart piece, which is why we are ending each of these lessons with going to the fruit of the Spirit inventory. So at the end of chapter 2, you will find some questions that go around with the fruits of the Spirit that are found in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, where it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. How's your saving lined up? Is it lining up with those fruits of the Spirit? I hope it is, but if not, I encourage you to take those steps, make those changes to be able to save God's way.
So you can right now look at those questions, whether you're by yourself or you're with a group, and as you record those, maybe take some time as well to share that with other people around you.